Okay, here we continue in our series of swing state evaluations. We're going to look at a whole bunch of states that are not just battleground states, but ones that there are a lot of questions about. So in this particular segment, we're just going to tackle two, just get them out of the way, New Mexico and Iowa. On westward to New Mexico, you can see our New Mexico road right here. This state is not up for grabs by any conventional standards. This is a welfare state. It's the number one SNAP and number one welfare recipient in the country by a large margin. So it is religiously dependent upon Democratic policies. However, Trump has made significant inroads, excuse me, and it's hard to believe that the border policy is not of interest to them. And so you'll see a rightward shift in the polls by about 3 to 5 points. This was pretty heavily carried, but I think it was about 9 points in previous elections. It has the capacity to go to 5 points. We've seen that before. And as a small state, it's quite movable. But as you'll see here, it's likely to take a couple cycles for GOP victory. So it's unlikely that Trump wins this one. By the numbers, New Mexico has a large polling gap. You can see about 7% in terms of the raw average. The sampling appears to be accurate, but the pollsters involved in New Mexico have a history of statistical bias by about two in a quarter points. And you'll see that here in the weighted margin of error. And so that puts it closer to about 4.5 to 5 points. If we're looking at the recall rebalance, not a lot of movement there. In terms of the scorecard application, you can see if we're using natural realized results versus the Nate Silver and Real Clear Politics scorecards, it's actually a little bit less biased. Switch back there. And if you want more information about what it is that I'm doing on screen to sort of see and understand what each of those columns are, take a look at a North Carolina video that's going to have a lot more information about how this chart works. There's also some information at the end here, it goes over sourcing and all that. So what we're seeing here is pretty much a loss of about 4.5 points. That seems to be pretty consistent when you actually look at the results themselves. The polling information here is very limited for obvious reasons. We've only had 3 polls this month because it's not considered really a battleground. One of the most important things to note in terms of early voting is that 50% have already cast their votes. This is very different than what you saw in New Hampshire, where it's only about 9%. And so what you're seeing here in terms of party affiliation disparity is likely to hold pretty strongly throughout. And as you can see here, there's a 10-point gap. And so Democrats are likely to take this. So on the whole, in terms of early voting, Republicans are actually have a lot to be happier about. And they are doing better than the numbers in the summary tab we just looked at suggest. They are outpacing their population by it's about 5% here, but if you look at it in comparison to Democrats, it's about 2%, 2.5% gap. And then men are excuse me, are outpacing the national average by about 2% over here compared to women. So they're actually doing better than the national average when adjusting for the 65 plus gender disparity, where that demographic has turned out 1.9% higher than the rest of the national average when adjusting for the fact that it houses about 2% higher population of 65 plus than the rest of the nation, which is about 17.7. So for these numbers, I mean, in terms of men turning out and Republicans turning out compared to the rest of the nation, it's actually pretty good. These are good numbers for Republicans. But with 50% of likely voters having already voted, the 10-point gap in party affiliation that you see here is likely too large to overcome. Excuse me. And so given that Republicans really only gained about a 2-point advantage here, between here and here, or 2.5 points, it's likely that they're not going to gain much more from there. Obviously you can see here in terms of the female turnout here, the second half is likely to be majority men by about similar 10% or so. And so for that reason, you have a reason to believe that this gap will get smaller. It might get smaller by 3 to 3.5 points, bring it closer to 7, maybe 6.5. But with only 16 to 25% of the remaining vote being unaffiliated, that's going to be 16% if you're looking at this gap. and 25% if you're looking at the actual unaffiliated registration, no party affiliation itself, then Trump would need to win 2/3 of the remaining votes, unaffiliated votes, to win New Mexico. That's a tall order. It's not out of the question. Could entirely happen. He is doing about that well nationwide in terms of unaffiliated new voters, independent voters. But I suspect he comes up short and falls to about a 4.5 to 5 point loss. Now, quickly regarding Iowa, I haven't tabulated data for Iowa because it's simply too little and not widely considered a toss-up. That said, to briefly touch on the Des Moines +3 Harris poll that's been really making a lot of noise out there, it is statistically an outlier if you look at the head-to-head and even the multi-polls. You can see Emerson, huge 10-point gap. This is a huge outlier in terms of historic data for Iowa. So it's not likely to hold. That said, Iowa's particularly close in midterms, so it's reasonable to consider this as a toss-up. But general elections have a different demo than midterms, and Trump carries the new voter and the low info voter. So it's very unlikely that she's going to benefit in the way that she did in the midterms. But it's reasonable to consider it a toss-up, and party affiliation is tight in general. You'll actually see if you look at the early votes in Iowa, the party affiliation gap is a slim 1 point. But that is the early vote, and Republicans generally don't do the early vote, so this actually kind of, in a way, benefits them. So, but back to the polling question. The most egregious issue here is the notion that the 55+ vote is going to go to Kamala by a 12-point gap. That seems very, very unlikely. She might carry, you could see he carries 35 to 54. It's pretty much break even in terms of the Young demo, but the notion that she's going to win the 55+ by 12% is a little far-fetched. So for that reason, I consider this a throwaway poll. So that's your Iowa and New Mexico quick breakdown. Okay, so as we go through each of these, there are some important references you need to know. If you look at the spreadsheet itself and you dive down into any of the given tabs, you should see references for individual breakdowns for the actual source information for registered voters, likely voters, 65+ demographics and ratios for populations of men to women, Republican and Democrat registrations. Not all states do party affiliation registrations. Some of them do. Most of them do. Many of them don't require it. So you do have a lot of unaffiliated as well. So that sort of muddies the water a little bit. But bottom line is you'll see the references listed there. The actual references for poll data all comes from the Real Clear polling tabulation. We don't actually use their values. We just actually use that as sort of an aggregator for polling. So if you were to look at, I don't know, let's say Arizona, we're gathering all the polls that are listed here. We're not taking the rounded figures. We're only taking them when that's the only thing that's provided. So oftentimes actually providing the fractional differences, as well as sourcing the crosstab data for anomalies and inaccuracies in the demographic breakdowns related to registered and unregistered users or voters rather. So bottom line is all the data comes from here. We actually open up each of these, or I really do, and read the source data if it's provided, as often as it's provided, and then provide sort of breakdowns. As you can see, New Hampshire here, where there, are more accurate figures, where there are inaccuracies in or a disparity between the real results of 2020 and the what they call the recall vote in 2024 on 2020 results. Bottom line is they're coming from Real Clear polling. We don't use their average. We use our own. And then we use the early voting data as provided by NBC News, as well as any other references. So I'm not going to list those references on every single video. You've got them listed here. I'll try to list them in the actual descriptions as often as possible. If I miss any of those, you've got this information for reference, and you should have the spreadsheet as well if you want to take a look at that. Some breakdown information about how this chart works. Here you've got an average of polling information on the basis of simple moving average. So if I want 18-day moving average, or if I want a 45-day moving average, I can change it there. I can pull up until a few days ago. Let's say I want to see the data up until 7 days ago. So for 21-day moving average would be 28. If I want to use a recall rebalance, that's where I'm basically adjusting for the error in uh, party affiliation or 2020 vote rebalance. The party affiliation rebalance is really not an accurate figure. We really want to look at the 2020 rebalance. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail on other videos. And then you're looking at the weighted moving average. This is where we actually apply the scorecard for each pollster. Pollsters generally in general elections are left leaning. We apply the sample size rebalance to both the raw average and the margin of error. And then we look at how, if the 2020 misses were reapplied here, what this would look like, because there are different pollsters in 2020 as there are in 2024. So we don't have margin of error and statistical bias for all the data for 2020 as we do for 2024. Rather for 2024 as we do for 2020. So there is some value to sort of just looking at what the average turned out to be in 2020, the average miss. So this is the basics of what you're looking at. There will be another video that kind of will go into a little bit more detail, specifically the North Carolina video. Look at that if you want some more information. But here we go. We're just going to use this. This is our basic source of information for all of the next sort of blitz of states moving forward.